Hi everyone. Welcome to part 2 of week 5, the consolidation of Civil War memory. This is Christine. I'm sorry we ran out of time yesterday, and so I'm reaching out to you from my office here in Boston to talk a little bit about the Longfellow National Historic Site. And just as a point of recap, we started with the questions yesterday about how New Englanders viewed and participated in the reconstruction of the South. And in some ways, I think we were starting to segue into questions about not only the memory of Reconstruction, but whether or not the North needed to be reconstructed. And I also wanted to apologize to you. I was getting a little bit muddled about where you were in your reading. I had referenced some passages in Silber, and I realized that you're turning to that next week. So I think we might even circle back to some of these questions again when we cover Boston African American National Historic Site and Adams National Historical Park next week together. So I think April and I both keep returning to this question: are we asking the right questions when you think about Reconstruction and the possible connections to National Park Service sites? And I did want to circle back to Marsh Billings Rockefeller. Pardon the typo there in the slide itself. This is a new slide. You didn't see that during the presentation video last week. But I think you had expressed some tension or concern about the rather tenuous connections between this site and the themes of Reconstruction. And I thought it might be useful, because I'm not willing to give up on this yet, is to sort of pair two photographs from the late 19th century for you to take a look at and see where there might be connections in terms of thinking about what the North and the South faced in moving forward after the Civil War, in dealing with tremendous changes socially, politically, economically, particularly in the face of industrialization, either in the New South or in the North. On the left is a picture of Charleston in the spring of 1865. Gives you a sense of the devastation to many southern cities in the soon-to-be occupied South and what Southerners faced. And on the right is a photograph of Vermont, a different kind of devastation, a despoliation of the landscape. And so I guess to me the sort of question is, what took precedence in terms of the need for definitive action? And remember, this is what Billings was reacting to when he undertook scientific farming and the reforestation of the Marsh farm in Woodstock, starting right after the Civil War. And I also sort of offer this, again, Billings was an industrialist and a railroad tycoon who chose, I believe, to invest primarily in the West, not the South. He had a strong Republican commitment, didn't attain elective office as a Republican, but nonetheless I wonder how we sort of make those connections, that Billings didn't necessarily feel the need to invest in the reconstruction of the South, either in terms of political commitments or in terms of economic opportunities. And this may make sense when we also think about carpetbaggers. But anyway, just to put that out there, you don't have to take that up. And I also wanted to sort of backtrack a couple of steps. So one of the things that we had been talking about was Grant, and the sort of trajectory of memory of the Civil War is seen through the Grant Monument, the General Grant Monument in New York City. And it talked about the sort of progressive inclusion of memories of the Confederacy as nearly a century unfolded. So we had started out talking about Grant's funeral, and then ultimately the inclusion of, or the medallion, when the final monument was dedicated in 1897 that said, "Let us have peace," and then the inclusion of the busts, and then finally the murals. But it doesn't seem to be a clear linear trajectory in terms of welcoming Confederate imagery. Remember, in the funeral procession itself, the pallbearers included not only Union generals Philip Sheridan and Billy Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, but also the Confederate generals Joseph Johnston and Simon Buckner, as well as the president of the DAR, Logan. And sort of as an added bonus, and just please indulge this professional glee because these murals are endlessly fascinating to me, these are the lunettes that were installed by the Park Service, or co-sponsored by the Park Service in 1966 in celebration of the Civil War centennial, The lunette above, or the lunette at the top of Grant and Lee shaking hands at Appomattox, find really interesting. It's Lee who still has his weapon, his sword. It's sort of the image of the aristocrat. But I wanted to sort of point out that the ribbon above, the sort of banner above both Grant and Lee in the beak or talons of the bald eagle, not a dove, but the bald eagle, the national symbol, says, "Let us have peace." And I know April had brought this up yesterday about the medallion in 1897. A similar message in 1966, despite very different context, but again, two sort of imperialist wars looming on the horizon when this imagery was generated. So what might the memory of the Civil War and Reconstruction stand in for in terms of contemporary concerns? Another theoretical question. But let's move on to Longfellow. So this is another one where I think you're probably going to say, oh, this is a stretch, or sort of scratching your heads about how to make the connections. Longfellow National Historic Site was renamed quite recently as the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. And the site is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The National Park Service acquired the house and its collections in 1972 from the Longfellow Trust, which had been established by the family principally by, I believe, the poet's daughter, Alice Longfellow, as a house museum. And this is at the height of the house museum movement, particularly here in New England. But the house itself was constructed in the mid-18th century, or around the 1870s, 1780s, excuse me. It's a mid-Georgian house, and I don't have the construction date specifically. I know it's before the Revolution because the proprietor or the owner was a loyalist who fled. But it was the home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and for nearly 5 decades. So what in the world does this have to do with Reconstruction? Well, bear with me. Longfellow moved to the house as a boarder and as a young Harvard professor in the antebellum period, and he later became the owner of the house when his father-in-law, Nathan Appleton, presented the home to him as a wedding gift to Longfellow and his bride, Frances Appleton Longfellow. So when you get to the sort of week when we talk about textiles and New England textiles and the resumption of production, you'll probably circle back to this and think, the Appletons, a big Lowell family textile fortune that bought this house for Longfellow. Fanny Appleton Longfellow is seen on the right with her husband. She was Longfellow's second wife, and their 2 eldest children, Charlie and, I don't remember the kid's name. I'm sorry, I'll get that back to you, but the second son. He's a sort of minor player in the story anyway, and excuse the flippancy here. But Longfellow and Fanny were active in abolitionist circles in Cambridge before the war. They were close associates of Charles Sumner. Let's move on to the next slide. Before we talk about Charlie, just to sort of set the stage here too, Longfellow's reception throughout the nation was sort of spotty in the antebellum period. Certainly in New England, he was quite renowned, and in the Midwest, the American Midwest and West, he was as well. His poetry was seen as an ideal of civility and civilization. However, in the South, critics say that Southerners viewed the poet and his work as hallmarks of New England snobbery and hypocrisy, and so there's a bit of a sectionalism involved in the pre-war years that seem to have abated over time. Now, sort of to move fast forward, during the Civil War, Fanny died a painful death in a household accident in 1861, and in the years following the Civil War, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow expressed the desire for a sincere and harmonious reunion between North and South. And he actually started a rather dedicated 3-year-long process of studying and translating Dante's Divine Comedy amongst a cohort of literary colleagues in Cambridge, to me, which I think seems really curious. That would be that choice in 1864, whether it's the sort of depression over his personal loss or a broader sort of political statement about sort of descending into hell is sort of interesting to me. But let's talk about Charlie a little bit. Charlie was, of course, Henry and Fanny's first son, and he enlisted as a private in the Union Army as a teenager in 1863. And he later received a commission as a lieutenant in a cavalry regiment. He suffered a bout of camp fever or malaria early in his service, and then was seriously wounded near New Hope Church in Virginia later that year. And his father rushed to Alexandria. Of course, he was a man with resources and sought out his injured son. Probably had been notified by telegram that Charlie had been injured, and brought him home to Cambridge. And Charlie was granted an honorable discharge and became a veteran even before the close of the Civil War. So his position is probably somewhat different from many of the people that Jordan talked about in the GAR. I don't think that Charlie joined the GAR. In fact, he led a rather peripatetic life after the Civil War, traveling to Europe, Asia, Australia, and South America, and amassing an extensive collection of fine and decorative arts and books, including weapons. This photo is of Charlie in Japan, where he spent a great deal of time and brought back sort of regalia of a samurai or shogun. He maintained an existence on Beacon Hill and spent the last months of his life at the family's Brattle Street home, the Longfellow House, or the Vassal Craigie Longfellow House, before his death of pneumonia in 1893. It's a rather unconventional life, and I guess the question is sort of what was going on in Charlie's experience. Did he associate with other veterans? Did he run from that? Is this unconventional life evidence of trauma, or that sort of living republic of suffering that Jordan described amongst many Union veterans? And I think that sort of broader questions are, what the Longfellows were doing in Cambridge and what their cohort was doing in the decades after the Civil War, similar to the questions that I raised about the abolitionist activists and the literary circle or literary set in Concord. How did their experience, commitments, and concerns compare to those of their less privileged neighbors, and what were they thinking about the South? So that's it for this week. Tune in next week for another video. I am also going to send, along with this video link, in an email, some follow-up on the questions that you raised about the membership of the Ku Klux Klan and the class sort of breakdown in terms of white supremacy in the occupied South. Have a little bit of feedback from some colleagues, and thank you for joining us again today.